Juvenile law in the United States, shield of protection, or systemic loophole. Whenever the words juvenile crime appear in headline news in America, public debate resurfaces over whether the current juvenile law acts as a compassionate shield for troubled youth, or an outdated legal loophole that unintentionally shelters serious offenders from appropriate punishment. The United States, unlike many countries, has a distinct legal system for individuals under 18 years old. This unique framework reflects both the optimism and the caution with which American society views young people who break the law. The legal foundation for juvenile protection in the U.S. can be traced to the late 19th century, when reformers advocated that children should not be lumped in with adult criminals. The juvenile court system was born in 1899 in Illinois, promoting the belief that youthful offenders deserved rehabilitation over retribution. Today, every state has its own laws and court procedures for dealing with those under 18, but the underlying principle remains: young people, given time and support, can change. Key elements of juvenile law include confidentiality, the sealing of records, and restrictions on publishing the names and photographs of accused minors. This extends to the most notorious cases, instances so brutal they shock the conscience of communities nationwide. For many, this protection ensures minors are not forever haunted by their worst decisions as children, allowing them to reintegrate after serving their sentence. Yet others argue it denies the public's right to information and potentially endangers communities if the offender is released and their past remains hidden. Furthermore, juvenile offenders are typically subject to lighter sentencing. Judges may order probation, placement in a juvenile facility, or mental health counseling instead of extended prison terms. Even in cases of murder or assault, strict limits often exist on how long a minor may be detained. For more heinous acts, prosecutors sometimes attempt to waive up juveniles into adult court, but these waivers are controversial and inconsistently applied across states. Every year, heated legal battles erupt over whether certain teens should be tried and sentenced as adults. Underlying these policies is the notion that the adolescent brain is still developing, particularly in the areas responsible for impulse control and moral judgment. The Supreme Court has repeatedly held that children are less culpable than adults, citing developmental psychology and neuroscience. Their mistakes often reflect transient immaturity, not irredeemable corruption, wrote Justice Elena Kagan in a landmark decision. Despite these ideals, high-profile crimes committed by teens, especially those involving violence or premeditation, frequently test the public's tolerance for leniency. Families of victims demand accountability and question whether rehabilitation is truly realistic for some offenders. Media scrutiny, shifting political winds, and waves of public outrage have prompted several states to revisit their statutes, proposing stricter penalties and greater transparency in response to rare but horrifying cases. Ultimately, juvenile law in the U.S. occupies a precarious middle ground, always evolving, at times fiercely criticized from both sides. Is it a progressive shield that offers hope, redemption, and a chance for troubled youth to rebuild their lives? Or is it a gaping loophole which inadvertently diminishes justice and re-traumatizes victims' families? Every tragic case forces American society to wrestle with that difficult question, and with the imperfect, sometimes contradictory system meant to answer it. A sensational case that shook American society. Most Americans remember where they were when a shocking crime explodes onto the front page. A crime so disturbing and unexpected it rattles assumptions about safety, justice, and the boundaries of youth. In the late spring of 1999, a quiet town in the Pacific Northwest faced such a reality when a heinous crime, perpetrated by a not-yet adult, would forever alter not just a small family, but the very debate on juvenile crime in America. The town of Greenfield, Oregon, nestled among rivers and forests, had always prided itself on being a tranquil place where neighbors greeted one another, doors were rarely locked, and generational roots ran deep. It was a community where the word danger often seemed as distant as the big cities far down the interstate. On the evening of April 14, 1999, however, Greenfield's innocence was shattered in a single, irreversible episode. The Miller family, Andrew, Sarah, and their baby daughter Emily, lived in apartment 402 of a modest four-story complex. They weren't wealthy or influential. Andrew was an office worker. Sarah stayed home with Emily, tending to the apartment and readying dinner each evening before Andrew returned from work. They represented many American families, ordinary, hardworking, peaceful, with modest dreams of safety and happiness. But on that fateful Wednesday, Andrew returned not to a home filled with laughter, but to a chilling silence. The first signs of trouble, an untouched newspaper in the mailbox, An unlocked front door, scattered belongings inside, escalated quickly to terrifying proportions. What was initially a vague anxiety spiraled into horror when Andrew discovered, tucked away in the darkness of a closet, the violated and lifeless bodies of his wife and daughter. News of the crime tore through Greenfield with the force of a hurricane. Local police, unused to such violence, swarmed the building, cordoned off the area, and immediately began investigating. It wasn't long before the details, an inevitable fusion of trauma and rumor, began leaking into public consciousness. Sarah had been the victim of a brutal assault. Little Emily had suffered an equally tragic fate, and the attacker had apparently left the apartment in a state of disarray, absconding with items belonging to the family. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry raised disturbing questions. Investigators soon discovered that a maintenance apprentice recently seen in the building and known to several residents had not shown up for work and could not be located. Speculation swirled. By April 18th, just 4 days after the murders, police had made an arrest. The suspect was none other than Daniel Turner, an 18-year-old son of a local plumber, quiet and mostly invisible to the wider community. As the details emerged, shock gave way to anger, fear, and soul-searching. Daniel's age, hovering on the line between adult and juvenile by state law, forced legal authorities to make difficult, precedent-setting decisions. Would he be tried as an adult? Should his name and photograph be released? Could justice truly be served within the boundaries of juvenile protections? The town of Greenfield, justifiably paralyzed by grief, became a symbol throughout Oregon and the country of American society's uncertain handling of juvenile crime, especially when youth and evil intertwine in unimaginable ways. For months, the case would remain at the heart of public discourse, fueling legislative debate, media coverage, and changing forever the way Americans perceived protection in the context of juvenile law. The illusion of family serenity. Andrew Miller and his family had always seemed like a slice of wholesome small-town Americana. Andrew, a diligent 23-year-old office worker, was married to Sarah, also 23, whose days revolved around caring for their 11-month-old daughter, Emily. They lived together in apartment 402, tucked away on the top floor of a modest 4-story apartment building in the heart of Greenfield. A place where everyone knew their neighbors, and the promise of a safe, stable life felt as ordinary as it was cherished. The Millers were the embodiment of traditional values. Andrew carried the weight of providing for the family, navigating long hours at a steady job while Sarah nurtured their home, coordinated meals, read bedtime stories and sang lullabies, and kept a watchful, loving eye on their daughter during Andrew's absences. Their apartment was a reflection of their aspirations, tidy, humble, adorned with little tokens of new parenthood, and filled with laughter and the soft babble of a growing child. Sarah, by all accounts, was gentle, conscientious, and patient. She kept routines, morning walks with Emily, domestic chores, quiet afternoons spent in the company of books and children's music. When friends and relatives visited, they'd remark on how the Millers had cultivated such tranquility, even amidst the inevitable fatigue of young family life. They were not wealthy, but their affection was palpable, and their unity appeared unshakable. Still, even in towns like Greenfield where everyone imagined themselves insulated from the harder realities of the world, tragedy can breach any barrier. No one, least of all Andrew or Sarah, could have envisioned the dark fate awaiting them, or imagined their lives would be so violently, irrevocably changed in the blink of an eye. It is a cruel certainty that often it is precisely those who ask for nothing more than peace who are most blindsided when peace slips away. The Millers' story, at its heart, began as every neighbor's story, routine, loving, and quietly hopeful, with no sign of the storm that would soon tear through their lives. A fateful day. April 14th, 1999, started out like any other midweek day in the quiet town of Franklin Ridge, Oregon. The morning sun rose gently over the neatly ordered streets and the modest rows of apartment buildings, casting a soft warmth on families beginning their daily routines. For Andrew Miller, a 23-year-old office worker, the day was predictably uneventful. He commuted to his clerical job at a local insurance agency, exchanged small talk with colleagues, and spent his lunch break daydreaming about his daughter Emily's first birthday that was just weeks away. Little did he know, every minute that ticked by was bringing him closer to an unimaginable tragedy that would forever sever the timeline of his life into a before and after. At precisely 7:19 p.m., Andrew returned to the Miller family apartment at 402 Oakview Towers, a four-story building nestled among whispering oak trees and the gentle hum of suburban life. Climbing the stairs to the top floor, he was greeted by a subtle oddity, a rolled-up newspaper protruding from the mailbox. Normally, his wife Sarah would have already retrieved it during her morning routine walk with Emily. Nagged by a small but persistent twinge of anxiety, Andrew pocketed the newspaper as he approached the door, only to find it resting ajar. The lock, which Sarah was usually so diligent about securing, was unlatched. Andrew's heartbeat quickened. Pushing the door inward, he was instantly enveloped by an ominous darkness, the kind that suffocates every echo. Flicking the living room light switch, Andrew was met with a scene of chaos. Shoes scattered in the hallway, a child's toy overturned, a half-prepared bottle of formula leaking milk across the linoleum floor. The house felt violated, its sense of safety shattered. He moved from room to room, calling Sarah's name, then Emily's, a note of growing desperation tightening his voice. With each unanswered shout, dread swelled in his chest. He dialed Sarah's mother, hoping against hope that his wife and daughter had simply gone out for an impromptu visit or neighborhood stroll, but her answer provided no relief. She had not seen them and was equally bewildered by their absence. Driven by panic, Andrew began to piece together the unsettling evidence. The open door, the untouched breakfast dishes, the missing diaper bag. He remembered that Sarah kept Emily's favorite backpack in the bedroom closet for their afternoon walks. Rushing to the closet, he thrust open the door, bracing himself for anything, except what lay inside. The horrific sight that greeted Andrew is something no person should ever have to witness. There, in the cloistered shadows of the closet, was the lifeless body of his wife, Sarah, covered with a quilt. Next to her, in the upper compartment, lay Emily, still and silent. Andrew collapsed in tears and shock, the surreal weight of the moment flattening him to the floor. Trembling, he found the strength to call 911, sobbing as he tried to explain the unexplainable. Within moments, the peaceful exterior of Oakview Towers erupted into chaos. Red and blue police lights flashing across the night, officers swarming the halls, and stunned neighbors lining the streets. For Andrew Miller, for his family, and for the town of Franklin Ridge, this single day, the day that would come to be known simply as the tragedy, marked an irrevocable loss of innocence and a shattering descent into darkness. First life shock and terrifying discovery. Andrew's world shattered in a single, grotesque instant. As he stood on the threshold of the closet, time seemed to fracture, the ordinary edges of his small apartment blurring with an unreality he could neither process nor accept. The horror of discovery landed first as a cold paralysis, the mind's futile refusal to make sense of the impossible. His wife, Sarah, so full of laughter and warmth the night before, now lay motionless, hidden beneath a quilt she herself likely folded 100 times. The ragged gasp that escaped his lips was primal, raw, something he barely recognized as coming from himself. Shock threatened to drown out everything, but Andrew's instincts, desperate, parental, forced him to scan the closet again. His gaze caught on the tiny, unmoving form of Emily, wedged above in the shelving, just out of reach. Panic eclipsed logic. He reeled back, knocking over a pile of shoes, scrambling for his phone with shaky, numbed hands. As he dialed 911, his voice alternated between incoherent sobbing and frantic shouting. The words he spoke, "My wife, my daughter, dead," tasted bitter and unreal in his mouth. The moments that followed moved in a surreal fog. Sirens grew from distant background noise into a blaring cacophony outside his building. Neighbors, hearing his wails or the sudden arrival of emergency vehicles, began crowding in the hallway, faces blanched with fear, voicing questions Andrew couldn't answer. Police officers burst into the apartment, their authoritative presence providing a shaky scaffolding of order amid chaos. Andrew was ushered gently to the living room, hands steered him toward a kitchen chair as paramedics and detectives flooded the hallway, sealing off doorways and scouring the area for clues. In those interminable minutes, Andrew's sense of reality disintegrated. The apartment became a strange museum of domestic life abruptly abandoned. Sarah's recipe scrawled on a notepad near the stove, bottles of baby lotion on the changing table, Emily's bib still stained from breakfast. These ordinary artifacts, the mundane markers of a young family, now mocked him, meaningless in the context of what he had found. Detectives asked their questions in hushed tones. The coroner's team quietly started their work. Andrew, still trembling, could only repeat the details again and again. "I came home, nobody called, I couldn't find them, then I... For Andrew, this was more than the end of a chapter, it was the obliteration of an entire world. It was 1,000 promises shattered in a heartbeat, grief and shock fused into a wordless, icy anguish. The horror of that discovery would become the dividing line in his life, everything before and everything after. Police investigation, and the first clue. When the first responders arrived at the chaotic scene in apartment 402, Greenfield's quiet streets had already been overrun by squad cars, ambulances, and fire engines. Yellow police tape cordoned off not just the hallway but the entire block, a visual assault on the town's sense of security. Detectives from the city's major crimes unit joined local officers quickly, recognizing that the brutal nature and vulnerability of the victims demanded immediate, rigorous intervention. The first step was a meticulous examination of the scene. Forensic specialists worked alongside the police, donning gloves and shoe covers as they cataloged every item out of place. The overturned toys, the spilled formula, the scattered mail. Flashbulbs illuminated the morbid interior. Photos of the closet, the state of the living space, and every visible bruise or restraint mark. Even the smallest trace, from a carpet fiber to a boot print on the linoleum, was preserved and bagged for later analysis. Detectives interviewed Andrew Miller in a neighbor's apartment, away from the immediate trauma of his home. He recounted his routine the moment he knew something was wrong and the unfolding horror. His timeline became a key reference. He had left for work at 7:15 a.m. Sarah and Emily were last seen taking a walk around 10 o'clock. The first sign of trouble was the untouched newspaper when he returned just after 7 p.m. Importantly, Andrew insisted the apartment had been locked when he left, and Sarah was fastidious about security. The absence of forced entry immediately shifted police suspicion. Someone had been allowed inside or had used a master key. Nothing of major value was missing, only Sarah's wallet and a few small electronics had vanished, just enough to suggest either a staged robbery or a criminal with personal motives. Investigators paid special attention to maintenance records, building staff, and anyone who might have had access to keys or codes. At the same time, a team began canvassing the building's tenants. Most had only routine observations, but a handful recalled seeing a young man in coveralls lingering in the hallway, someone not from the Miller family. A maintenance apprentice had done a few repairs in the building in recent weeks. With this information, police ran a background check and discovered that Daniel Turner, a local apprentice plumber, was unexpectedly absent from work and unreachable. DNA swabs, fingerprints, and trace evidence were collected and sent to the forensic lab with high priority. Investigators sifted through security camera footage from nearby businesses, piecing together the hours leading up to the crime. By the end of the first 48 hours, police had amassed a growing list of circumstantial leads, but it was the combination of eyewitness recollection and forensic promise that propelled the search for a suspect forward. Trust in the simple day-to-day safety of Greenfield cracked as the investigation unfolded, with the community following each new rumor or police action with fear and fascination. The eerie sense that evil had been invited in, rather than having forced its way, haunted both citizens and law enforcement as the manhunt intensified. A juvenile suspect emerges. As the investigation gained momentum, suspicion rapidly began to consolidate around a previously unremarkable figure, Daniel Turner, the 18-year-old apprentice plumber. To the outside world, Daniel had been nearly invisible, a background character in the daily life of Greenfield, seen only in passing as he carried tools between units or trailed after his father on routine maintenance calls. But with every hour that passed after the attack, signs increasingly pointed in his direction. Detectives reviewing maintenance logs noted that Daniel had been scheduled to perform minor repairs in the Miller's building around the time of the crime. Several residents, when re-interviewed, remembered seeing him lingering in common areas, sometimes pausing to glance up at doorways as if checking apartment numbers. A maintenance manager reported Daniel's sudden absence both on the afternoon of the crime and in the days that followed, highly unusual for a young man whose main source of structure was his work routine. Efforts to contact Daniel were unsuccessful. Calls to his cell phone went unanswered. His small car was still parked at the family home on the outskirts of town, but Daniel himself was nowhere to be found. His father, bewildered and defensive, told officers that Daniel had left early the morning after the crime and had barely spoken to anyone since. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry at the Turner residence, but Daniel's bedroom told a different story. A packed backpack, scattered coins, and a few crumpled bills on the bed, along with a missing work uniform and muddy boots. When police finally tracked Daniel down at a rundown motel several miles away, he appeared pale, exhausted, and deeply anxious. Officers noted minor scratches on his hands and arms, marks he claimed were from carrying plumbing supplies. He offered a confused account of his whereabouts during the previous 24 hours, stumbling over basic facts about what jobs he had performed and when he had last spoken to his father. Detectives quietly took photographs, collected his clothing for forensic analysis, and brought him in for questioning. Community speculation exploded into frantic concern when news of Daniel's arrest leaked to the public. Neighbors who had chatted politely with the quiet young man struggled to make sense of the charges. Whispers about his difficult family life, frequent police visits to the Turner home in the past, his mother's recent death, rumors of odd solitary behavior at school, rose quickly to the surface, amplified by the media's relentless coverage. The label of juvenile suspect carried a uniquely volatile charge. He was both tragic and terrifying, a reminder that danger sometimes lurked in the least expected faces. The turbulent past of the suspect. Daniel Turner's troubled past was a tapestry woven with threads of heartache, neglect, and exposure to violence from his earliest memories. He was born into a cramped, peeling house on the outskirts of Portland, sharing a bedroom with two younger siblings while his parents' marriage slowly unraveled in the room across the hall. His father, an alcoholic with a mercurial temper, was in and out of work, sometimes gone for days, other times slumped on the porch with a bottle in hand, hurling insults that rang out like gunshots long into the night. Daniel's earliest lessons were about silence, how to tiptoe past a sleeping drunk, how to read anger in slamming doors, how to listen for the sudden hush that always preceded his mother's muffled crying. His mother, once vibrant and artistic, fell into a deep depression that darkened the whole house. Prescription pill bottles multiplied on the bathroom counter, meals became haphazard, and the sense of predictability that anchors childhood crumbled. Daniel cared for his siblings as best he could, walking them to school, making boxed macaroni, improvising stories to comfort them during the worst nights. But he could do nothing to prevent what happened the summer before he turned 12, when his mother's despair swallowed her whole. She took her own life, and the family, already on the edge, plunged into chaos. After her death, Daniel's father spiraled further, sometimes vanishing altogether, only to lurch home for stretches marked by violence and neglect. Social workers visited intermittently, but as Daniel grew older he became adept at minimizing bruises and spinning stories to keep his family together. School, which could have been a haven, quickly became a minefield of humiliation. Bullied for his hand-me-downs and limp hair, he retreated deeper, his grades falling away and his face taking on a blank, impenetrable stillness. Teachers tried to reach him, but Daniel answered questions with monosyllables and hunched shoulders, his presence barely registering in class photos. He developed a reputation for odd, solitary behavior, silent lunches, sessions in the library scanning damaged true crime paperbacks, a morbid fascination with newspaper stories of violence and loss. By his mid-teens, Daniel was drifting. He discovered his father's secret stash of liquor and pills, using them to quell nightmares and numb the sense of despair and abandonment. The home, filled with holes in the drywall and the perpetual smell of stale beer, became a prison. Daniel started to visit internet chat rooms, seeking connection but often stumbling into dark corners of the web filled with disturbing imagery and anonymous hostility. Friendships were rare, brief, and always fizzled under the weight of Daniel's unpredictability or discomfort. Desperate for routine, Daniel joined his father on plumbing jobs in the city, first as a tag-along, then as a semi-reliable helper. He found a strange sense of peace in working with his hands, slinking through crawl spaces, tightening pipes, patching leaks far away from the seething tension at home. If only for a few hours, he could put order to something broken, even as he remained unable to fix what was truly shattered in his own life. Neighbors pitied Daniel, but kept their distance, unsure whether to fear him, help him, or simply ignore the troubled young man skulking from home to work and back again. Silence, once his shield, became his curse, an invisible barrier that kept out pain as well as hope. The day of the tragedy. April 14, 1999 dawned utterly ordinary for Daniel Turner, but the day would spiral into infamy by sunset. That morning, Daniel awoke in his cramped childhood bedroom, the routine drone of his father's radio news intermingling with the metallic clatter of pipes in the kitchen. He dressed in his greasy blue apprentice's overalls, a uniform that gave him a rare sense of belonging and purpose, and methodically packed his battered toolbox, making sure to include his ID badge and a pair of cheap work gloves. Sleep had been fitful and unrestful. Daniel's mind teetered between uneasy anticipation and opaque dread. Instead of heading straight to his work assignment, Daniel drifted toward Oakview Towers, the Millers' apartment complex. He loitered outside, pacing the edges of the parking lot and fixating on the bustle of suburban morning routines. Parents buckling kids into car seats, the blur of delivery vans, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Every so often, Daniel checked his watch, pulse quickening at the thought of what lay ahead, uncertainty and compulsion warring within him. He felt both trapped and invisible, swept along by forces he neither fully understood nor could control. Daniel climbed the back staircase, fingering the set of master keys he'd swiped from his father's toolbox. He knocked on several apartment doors under the pretense of checking the building's water pressure and made notes on a clipboard, mimicking the motions he'd seen his father perform countless times. No one questioned him. After all, he had the uniform and the right air of unremarkable submission. When Daniel reached apartment 402, he hesitated, hovering in the hallway as the muffled sound of a child's laughter filtered through the door. His heart lodged painfully in his throat. Sarah Miller greeted Daniel with a courteous smile, recognizing him from previous maintenance visits. She welcomed him inside, holding baby Emily on her hip as she described a leaky faucet in the kitchen. Daniel nodded, barely listening as the world seemed to blur at the margins. The comforting domestic scene, the scent of fresh laundry, Emily's babbling, the soft clink of dishes, stood in stark contrast to the storm brewing just beneath the surface of Daniel's consciousness. At what specific moment horror took over intention, even Daniel would later struggle to recall. A surge of impulse, a catastrophic crack in his self-control, sent events careening into violence. The comforting mask of routine shattered. The next minutes passed in disjointed fragments, a shout, a struggle, Sarah's desperate attempts to protect her daughter, the sickening realization that nothing could be undone. Objects toppled, cries echoed, then abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was cavernous and devastating, leaving Daniel breathless and nauseous as he stumbled through the wreckage of what he'd done. Legal verdicts and judicial disputes. The verdict in Daniel Turner's case sent immediate ripples of tension and outrage throughout Greenfield and far beyond its sleepy borders. The gravity of his crimes, 2 innocent lives lost in an act that was both calculated and shockingly brutal, stood in stark contrast to the protections afforded to him under state and federal juvenile laws. Unlike in adult court, his name and photograph were suppressed in most media outlets, and the courtroom itself was closed off to the public and press for nearly every hearing. For a small community so deeply scarred by the tragedy, this veil of legal confidentiality became its own source of resentment and rumor. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution faced a colossal burden. Their case was supported by an array of forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and Daniel's own conflicting statements under interrogation. Yet because he had just barely turned 18, a tidal wave of legal questions arose about how, or if, he should be tried as an adult. Prosecutors filed a motion demanding Daniel be waived up to adult court, citing the extreme violence, his apparent premeditation, and the community interest in transparency and public safety. Daniel's defense responded with arguments about his traumatic upbringing, stunted emotional development, and the fundamental differences in the adolescent brain, as supported by recent neuroscientific studies. These arguments were not only persuasive to some, but also enshrined in numerous Supreme Court opinions providing special protections for youthful offenders. Weeks of legal wrangling ensued, with experts on both sides testifying about Daniel's mental state, the potential for rehabilitation, and the risk he posed to society. Members of the Miller family took the stand, their grief palpable in every word, demanding the severest punishment and invoking the need for justice, if not vengeance. Their pain reverberated through media reports which, though limited in identifying Daniel directly, made the family's heartbreak the emotional center of the case. In the end, the judge faced an agonizing decision. After exhaustive hearings, she ruled that Daniel would remain in the juvenile system, subject to a maximum penalty of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Significantly lighter than the mandatory sentences often imposed in adult court for similar crimes. This outcome sent shockwaves of indignation through Greenfield and beyond. Many residents felt the juvenile protections designed long ago with misguided optimism had provided a loophole for someone capable of monstrous violence. Victims' advocates decried the ruling as a failure of the system, fearing it set a precedent that blurred the line between compassion and injustice. At the same time, legal experts and children's rights advocates defended the outcome, arguing that American justice must always leave room for rehabilitation and redemption, even for the deeply troubled. They pointed to Daniel's traumatic childhood and raised broader questions about the adequacy of mental health interventions and the responsibilities of the state toward at-risk youth. The courtroom became both an arena for individualized justice and a battleground for philosophical debates about punishment, protection, and public safety. As news cycles churned on, debates raged everywhere from the local diner to national think tanks. Was the verdict a courageous act of mercy or a disastrous concession that threatened the very foundations of justice? In Greenfield, many felt the wounds would never truly heal, not only because of the crime itself, but because the law seemed once again unable to deliver the clarity or closure that tragedy so often demands. Pressure for legal reform and the call for justice. In the weeks and months following the verdict, Greenfield was transformed from a humble, tight-knit community into the flashpoint for a nationwide debate about juvenile justice reform. The grief and anger of the Miller family resonated in town hall meetings, newspaper op-eds, and even state legislative chambers, becoming a rallying cry for those demanding tougher consequences for minors who commit egregious crimes. Political leaders, state senators, governors, and national advocates visited Greenfield, meeting with residents and the Miller family to express both condolences and support. Calls for new laws echoed through the media: mandatory minimum sentences for violent juvenile offenders, greater transparency in juvenile proceedings, and expanded powers to try minors as adults in the most severe cases. Advocacy groups on both sides mobilized. Children's rights organizations cautioned against losing sight of rehabilitation by swinging the pendulum too far toward retribution. In contrast, crime victims' advocacy groups amplified the Millers' pain, arguing that justice must prioritize public safety and the dignity of victims over second chances for perpetrators. The town's small city hall witnessed impassioned debates. Town meetings overflowed with residents, some holding candles and photos of Sarah and Emily, others brandishing signs: "Justice for victims," "No more secrets," and "Reform now." Survivors and families recounted personal stories of loss, while legal experts delivered presentations dissecting flaws and strengths of juvenile statutes. The media, eager for a symbol, granted the Miller tragedy national coverage: morning shows, podcasts, even late-night debates, all parsing the legacy of the case and the need for change. Greenfield's representatives introduced a bill, the Miller Act, proposing that any minor accused of a crime resulting in death should be subject to public hearings and eligible for adult sentencing regardless of age. Although the bill faced fierce opposition from civil liberties groups and some lawmakers, the groundswell of public opinion pushed committees to debate the measure in televised sessions. Petitions circulated, amassing thousands of signatures. Survivors from other states traveled to Greenfield to add their voices to the call for reform, telling hauntingly similar tales of loss and legal frustration. Simultaneously, critics of the proposed reforms warned about the dangers of reinventing juvenile justice in a climate of fear and grief. Editorials reminded readers of the original intent of juvenile law: to rescue, not just punish, broken children. Experts in adolescent psychology testified at hearings, insisting that the horrific acts of a few must not dictate policies affecting all vulnerable youth. The pressure cooker atmosphere forced a rare national reckoning. Was the legal system truly failing victims, or simply upholding the principle that children, even those who do terrible harm, are fundamentally different from adults? Could the law protect both society's safety and the redemptive possibilities of troubled youth? Greenfield, once a dot on the map, had become the epicenter of America's enduring struggle between compassion and consequences, its grief echoed by millions, its questions as urgent as ever. Reflecting on justice and juvenile protection law. In the years following the tragedy, as Greenfield's collective wounds remained raw and the broader American public continued to return to the case in conversations about law and morality, the debate over justice and juvenile protection laws achieved new depth and urgency. Every anniversary of the crime, every major development in Daniel's incarceration, was met with renewed scrutiny. Was the justice system fulfilling its duty to the victims, their families, or the greater good, or was it, as critics claimed, offering undue mercy to those who crossed unimaginable boundaries simply because of their age? Justice in the context of juvenile crime, society would come to realize, is not a static or universal principle. Rather, it is a shifting, sometimes contradictory ideal, shaped by evolving science, public sentiment, and hard-learned lessons. On the one hand, Modern neuroscience consistently reinforced the notion that teenagers, even those capable of extreme violence, are fundamentally works in progress. Their brains are not yet fully wired for consequence, empathy, or moral restraint. Advocates cited study after study, demonstrating the plasticity of the adolescent mind and making the case that exposure to trauma, deprivation, or untreated mental illness profoundly affects behavior in ways the law must consider. In support, the Supreme Court delivered landmark rulings emphasizing diminished culpability and forbidding automatic life without parole sentences for minors, grounding these decisions in both compassion and empirical evidence. Yet for every argument in favor of rehabilitation, there arose an equally powerful counter-narrative rooted in the lived anguish of survivors and communities. Families like the Millers, forever marked by loss, could not accept that justice meant closure without accountability, without real and to them proportional punishment. Their voices, joined by scores of victims' advocacy groups, drew a hard line. Some acts, no matter the perpetrator's age, simply demanded a response that reaffirmed society's moral boundaries. They pointed to statistics showing low recidivism rates for some juvenile offenders, but countered with chilling exceptions. Cases where troubled youths reoffended or where leniency failed to prevent continued harm. In state legislatures, courtrooms, and community forums, citizens were confronted with impossible questions. Could the law ever truly balance the hope of redemption with the imperative of safety? Did offering second chances undermine the experience and memory of victims, or did it mark a society's courage to believe in change? Was a legal system's greatest duty to rehabilitate or to punish? As years passed, the Greenfield case continued to echo beyond its small-town origins, serving both as a warning and a testament. A warning of what is lost when failures to intervene early allow trauma to ferment into tragedy, and a testament to the complexity of justice itself. No matter how many reforms were proposed or statutes amended, it became clear that the law could never eliminate risk or grief. But it could, at best, keep striving to honor every life touched by both mercy and consequence. For those drawn to the question of juvenile crime either by personal loss or broader principle, reflection remains an uneasy, ongoing process. The story of Daniel Turner and the Millers does not resolve easily into slogans or certainties. It occupies that gray space where empathy, anger, fear, and hope all do battle, a reminder that for all its limitations, the pursuit of justice is ultimately a reflection of our deepest uncertainties and our greatest aspirations as a society.